Well, those are the only cues I'm actually going to play, but I do want to talk about a couple more, and one of them is one you've already mentioned, which is Jane's demise. This refers to an unforgettable scene that's frequently cited as the precise moment where any ambiguity about Walt's descent into immorality has been removed. I mean, at this point, he's no longer Breaking Bad; he has broken bad. In the scene, he has the opportunity and really the human obligation to save someone's life, but he decides to let them die instead, just out of his own self-interest. Granted, the person in question was threatening to expose him and trying to blackmail him, but even so, just standing there and watching someone die is pretty cold-blooded. So what was your first thought about how you wanted to express all that musically?
It was certainly a huge moment in the show, and a huge moment for me, and a great opportunity too, musically, but very difficult. And I knew it was going to be a very tightrope walk to accomplish what I wanted to do, which was to add, the first part of the cue actually, add warmth, so that you, which is a bit of a cheat, but it's sort of setting you up a little bit to feel for Jane, and then at the back half of the cue, just to add weight, add immense amount of gravity, hopefully without necessarily commenting on Walt's actions, because we talk about this often on Breaking Bad, but one of the pillars of the show, at least for me, is that everybody has a different take on Walter White, and we all view him through our own lens. And there are those who have been appalled by Walter White since episode 2, and feel that there's absolutely no redemption to be found. And there are those who will stand by his actions till the very bitter end, no matter what he does. And I think we want to leave it that way. We want it to be that way. And one of the things I try to avoid with the score is to be overly telling or overly commenting on a situation. And this one was very tough because it is so emotionally charged. And Brian's performance is absolutely fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
And the shades of gray and just the subtle shifts of being able to watch his eyebrows move and think about where his brain must be going as he contemplates the different courses he can take in those few seconds. And then the anguish but realization that he's going to do absolutely nothing.
Well, as I recall the scene, his first impulse was to move towards her and do the right thing.
Absolutely.
Then his brain kicks in, he stops, and as he does it, he does shed a tear.
Absolutely.
He doesn't like, do a dance on her grave and laugh about it.
No.
He has regret and remorse.
Yes.
But if she was anybody else, he might not, it's very complex and, like you said, a very gray area.
Absolutely, and many different shades within the gray.
Yeah.
But as you point out, ultimately his self-interest wins out, as it always does.
Yeah, pretty creepy. The only thing I've ever seen that is anywhere close to that is there's a 1940s film called Leave Her to Heaven, starring Gene Tierney, in which she has a boy. I think he has some type of disability. He's trying to swim across a lake, and she's in a rowboat, and he gets a cramp, and he yells out for her to help him. And because she's just jealous of the attention he gets from her husband, it's her husband's little brother, she just watches him drown.
Oof. Wow.
It's brutal. I mean, Martin Scorsese did some type of thing about film, and he actually included that image on the cover. It definitely struck him when he saw it in the theater. It was like, whoa.
Wow, I'm going to check that out. I'm curious.
Yeah, it's called Leave Her to Heaven, 1945 or something.
Wow.
I also like the scene where Walt goes to Gus's house, and you have a typical Walter White cue playing that you abruptly cut off when he puts on his hat and makes his transformation into Heisenberg, at least in his own mind anyway. So how do you determine when it's appropriate to emphasize a character's internal world instead of their external one, which can often be quite different?
I think as a general rule, with the exception of the more driving and action-driven cues, like the Aztec cue, for example, which are very visceral and about the action on screen, more often than not, the music's role is to play the inner workings of the characters that we see.
Yeah.
and that's certainly an example. And you're right; it is a callback to an earlier piece of music that I wrote end of season 2? End of season 3, when Walt gathers up the courage and puts on his hat and walks across this great expanse of desert to meet Gus Fring, knowing that he could very well not survive it. And the donning of the Heisenberg hat, of course, has become symbolic of that. It's in part symbolic of his transformation, but to me, it's always been more about his own perception of his transformation.
Yeah, that's why the question occurred.
Right, much more than any real change.
Yeah, he thinks he's adopted this character, but is putting if I put a little hat on, is everybody going to view me differently? Maybe, maybe not. But how does it affect me internally?
Right, it seems to work for him.
Yeah.
And as I think you mentioned earlier, that I performed that on a Japanese koto, which I actually own. Play, and but I processed it to fit a little bit into that Western world, thinking we talk often about movies like Once Upon a Time in the West and Sergio Leone movies, and the power of doing a lot with not too much.
Yeah, that would be one example of a cue you've written that I could sing back to you.
Yep, there aren't too many.
In fact, that's why I started this podcast with that combination of notes. And ordinarily, I wouldn't have known what a Japanese koto was, but back in the 80s, Ronnie Montrose did this one-man show.
Okay.
And he had one there, and he explained to everybody what it was, and then he played it.
Yeah, I had the good fortune of studying for a year in college in Japan. I studied a lot of traditional Japanese music, and I gravitated towards the koto because it's very malleable, and it's very it still has a lot of ways in which it can be totally useful in modern music and in Western music, which isn't true of all Asian instruments.
No.
But because it's like essentially a big guitar, but the bridges are movable.
Yeah.
So that each string can be tuned into any scale, including a Western one. And it's got a terrific, very delicate sound that still has some inner strength in it that I've always loved.
Yeah, I agree with all that. After you've completed and submitted your score, how often do they ask you to make alterations or changes to it? And are they usually pretty minor?
They usually are. There's some cues go flying right through, and this is essentially Vince. I mean, all the music goes through to Vince, and he gives his notes, and then ultimately it does go on also to the network and the studio. But Vince is really the driving force there, and every now and again I hit a foul ball. And it just it misses the mark, either usually emotionally, or I've misunderstood the scene and emphasized the wrong thing, which happens on occasion. But most of the time, it's very subtle comments like that about well, I wish it would feather in a little bit more, or in this section, I wish it was had a little more gravity, or comments like that, which I address pretty quickly.
Well, of course, you are working in isolation, so he isn't hearing the whole process. He's just hearing, bam, what you did, which is probably good from his point of view. So, you'll have like 27 drafts in your head, but he'll only hear the final one. So
that's right, and of course, he wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to subject anyone ever to having to sit through me plotting through all the wrong ideas to find the right one.
No, not at all. Yeah, another one of your signatures on the show is the way you compose a new version of the theme for every episode to play over the closing credits, which incorporates an element of that week's show. It might be the sound of a sledgehammer, or an insect, or a playground swing, or a bell. So is that closing musical statement something you really enjoy coming up with, or does it become something of a chore at this point?
That's a good question. I still do enjoy it. I'm glad at the end of each season that I have some time off from it to think about new ideas, because by the end, it is tough to do that. And I also like to try to employ different instruments to perform the theme, in addition to the various sound design elements I'm trying to work in there too. So often it reflects a cue that I wrote that appears earlier in the episode.
Yeah, some of them are, really, really cool.
Yeah.
I watched the show to get caught up. I don't know when I started watching it, third or fourth season, and then I watched them all on DVD.
Yep.
And I might not have noticed right away that you were doing that, but when you did do something, really so obvious that I knew it was a reflection on that particular episode, then I started to listen for it.
Yeah, we started it. Part of it was a technical decision that occurred in season 2, actually. In the first season, our show went directly from the end of the show into Vince Gilligan's credit and then into the end credits,
Yeah.
all uninterrupted. And then they changed the format
Yeah.
on AMC, so that the end credits then came later after commercials or something, which changed creatively how we could approach the end of episodes, because, for example, we couldn't end on a song that continued
Right.
through Vince's credit and over the end credits. And then, sort of by default, these end credits became their own standalone little island,
Yeah.
and a great opportunity for me to do some creative things, and I've really enjoyed doing it. I'm not sure I'll ever do it again, because it certainly adds an enormous amount of workload each episode.
Yeah, no one does a whole new theme song every episode.
That's right.
But you.
But the show deserved it, and obviously the amount of music that I write for Breaking Bad is less than many other composers write every week for their TV shows.
Well, that's true, unless you're doing a train robbery that has a 13-minute cue.
Yes, but which is the exception rather than the rule. But yes.
Well, since we're talking about credits, in the opening credits, they use a visual motif that incorporates a chemical element into all of the names appearing on the screen.
Yeah.
For example, in the show's title, the BR in Breaking and the BA in Bad represent bromine and barium.
Yes.
So in your case, they use the PO in Porter. So how do you feel about representing polonium?
I'm a big fan of representing polonium, but for the record, I had no say in this. This was this was all decided by minds higher up than mine.
And well, it was decided by the periodic table, I think.
Well, that too, of course, and what hadn't already been used by the time they got to me, I'm sure. But no, and I'll confess that I did have to go look it up, because I'm far from a science or chemistry.
I don't think I'd use the word confess. I don't think anybody knows off the top of their head what polonium is. I mean, my understanding is very rare, very unstable, and very radioactive. So it doesn't come up in your everyday life unless you're like mining uranium in Iran or something. I mean,
or you've been on the wrong side of the Russian secret security services,
right.
who seem to enjoy using it as their horrible assassination tool of choice.
Right, yeah, there's that aspect or element to make a pun, too.
Yeah.
Well, I want to mention a couple of other projects you've worked on. You did the score for a very interesting documentary about steroids called Bigger, Stronger, Faster.
Yeah.
And more recently, you scored the new ABC series, Red Widow. And I got to tell you that with Bigger, Stronger, Faster being about steroids and Breaking Bad being about meth, when I first heard about Red Widow, I thought, oh, well, great, Dave finally gets to do a show that isn't about drugs. So I started watching Red Widow. Sure enough, before long, someone says, "Who stole my cocaine?"
That's right.
So what is it with you and all these drugs, man?
I don't know. I can't seem to escape it. For someone with such little personal involvement in it, it is pretty funny.
It is a bizarre coincidence. But the thing about Bigger, Stronger, Faster, which I'd seen it once, maybe even twice, before I really noticed you had done the music, it's a much more conventional type of scoring. I mean, there is a lot of music played with the dialogue and more basic heroic cues, and someone's crying, more it's more. It's a good example that you don't have to do what you do on Breaking Bad. It's very much a choice.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm a classically trained composer. I started piano when I was very young, and played tons of classical music. Grew up on classical music, and write lots of classical music. it just wasn't the right choice for Breaking Bad. But there are certainly lots of other projects where I do, and I think my favorite actually is probably to blend the two, which I do a lot of in the score of Bigger, Stronger, Faster, blending orchestral elements and more current synthesizers and technology elements.
Yeah, well, speaking of orchestral instruments, I mean, on Red Widow, you're really working the cello.
Really working the cello, yes. Fantastic cellist here in L.A., Tim Liu, played all the cello on Red Widow, and that was certainly by design, and it really was a choice that I made to speak to the protagonist in that show, who's a very strong, if conflicted, female character.
Well, instead of New Mexico, now you've got San Francisco, and instead of a Mexican-type element, you've got Russian. So, definitely orchestral instruments are evocative of, Russian folk music and certainly Russian classical music.
That's right, which is hugely informed, or film music, I should say, is hugely informed by Russian classical music. Most film score music you hear has its roots in Rachmaninoff, Shostakovich, certainly big epic films.
Very true.
There's a definite link there. Not that I tried to do that on Red Widow. It didn't have the scope to do that, but we did have a great time doing a very big percussive score with more orchestral instruments.
Yeah, you got to have some variety. It can't all be about guitar feedback and reverb, dropping amps and stuff, kicking amps.
No.
Well, at the time we're recording this, you're still in the process of scoring the final episodes of Breaking Bad. Have they finished shooting the series yet?
They have.
And how many of these last ones have you seen so far?
I have now seen 3.
And you got 5 that you haven't seen.
5 that I haven't
seen. So I think
seen.
most people would probably say, well, show me everything and I'll create an arc for the characters and I know where. But I think it's way better to do what you're doing, because not only do you get the pleasure of seeing them like a fan, but like you said, if you don't know what's going to happen to these guys, it's going to influence what you write, I'm sure.
Oh, it is, and I certainly don't want to inadvertently be tipping anything or do anything that's telling, and I work very hard to be done with one before I move on to the next.
Well, speaking of that, I'll refer people back to a scene where Skyler is snooping around Walt's apartment.
Yeah.
And the music you wrote for that, it's like, it's non-committal. It doesn't give any tip-off, is she going to find something or not, but it still has an anticipatory feeling to it, which would seem incredibly hard to do.
It is the nature of so much of what I do for the show, and I hope I've gotten good at it.
I'm going to vote yes on that. Well, you're obviously not at liberty to discuss the content of the upcoming shows, but I do want to mention some of the things that I'll personally be watching for in the series conclusion. Now, I'm curious to see how Walt handles his son finding out about him being a drug dealer and a killer, because as a father myself, I know the opinion my kids have of me means more to me than anyone else's, more than like Hank or Marie's would.
Sure.
I'm also wondering if Jesse is ever going to find out the full extent of what Walt has done to him, including watching his girlfriend die, gambling with the life of his next girlfriend's son, and impulsively gunning down Jesse's friend Mike. So I'm wondering if Jesse's ever going to realize that his unwavering loyalty to Mr. White has been gravely misplaced, to say the least. I also want to find out if they're ever going to use that poison cigarette, which is originally meant for Tuco, then they aimed it at Gus, and then finally Lydia, but they've never actually used it. So I'm wondering about that. And then finally, I'm expecting to see some sort of payoff to this whole Scarface thing. I mean, the show was originally pitched as Mr. Chips becomes Scarface. The 2 of the actors on the show, Mark Margolis and Stephen Bauer, were actually in Scarface.
That's right.
I think some of your crew worked on that film as well. And most blatant of all, there's a scene where Walt and Walt Jr. are sitting on the couch watching Scarface. So at this point, I'm half expecting to see Al Pacino himself in your season finale.
Right.
And I know you can't comment on any of that, but I hope you can comment on this. Is it true that Vince Gilligan is going to be producing a Breaking Bad spin-off based on the character of Saul Goodman?
Well, you know about as much about that as I do, to be honest, but I think I can say what I know because I've read about it in the trades, just as you probably have, which is it is under discussion.
Okay.
There is the possibility, certainly, of a spin-off show that would revolve around the character of Saul Goodman. What I don't know is anything about it, whether it would be prequel, it would be afterwards, whether it would happen during the time of Breaking Bad, what kind of show it would be, honestly, and I don't think they know.
Yeah, if I was Vince Gilligan, I would be focused on, season 5B of Breaking Bad, and it's good to float that out there and everything. I didn't know enough about it. I'd heard from one source it was theoretical, like you said. From another source, it was, yes, we're going to do it. So,
I don't think that decision's been made. I mean, I think a decision has been made to pursue the concept.
Yeah, well, Bob Odenkirk is sitting by the phone right now with his hand just over the phone, just waiting for that sucker to ring. Do you know who the front runner might be for the composer on that show?
Oh, who knows?
I got my money on Giorgio Moroder.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Anything is possible. Anything is possible.
Well, it will make a lot of Breaking Bad fans very happy if there is a Saul Goodman show, because he's a very popular character.
He is, and he's been a wonderful addition to the show.
Well, as heavy as Breaking Bad sometimes gets, there have been many opportunities for levity, even in the most tense and dramatic situations. In fact, the entire series might well be characterized as a dark comedy. But some things on the show were done purely for the sake of comedy, which brings us to Twat Hammer.
Yes.
Now, this was a band that Jesse Pinkman played in with his friend Badger, long before they became entangled with Mr. White.
Right.
There's a scene where Jesse reminisces about his old band days with his former bass player, resulting in an impromptu performance of their big song, Fallacies.
Right.
So my understanding, the lyrics of that song were contributed by the writer of that episode, and the responsibility of setting them to music fell to you. Is that right?
That is correct, yes. And what a fun sort of side project for me to get to work on. Was so very, very different from the music that I write for the show. And in fact, as you mentioned, there are lots of comic, or certainly darkly comic moments in Breaking Bad, but we don't usually touch upon those with score. I think that they usually stand very well on their own, or there's a licensed piece of music maybe that's contributing to the humor. But so for me, a special chance to get involved in one of the more fun moments of the show, and I had a great time.
Would you characterize that genre as grunge?
I don't know. I think that when we talked about it, we really wanted it to be just like a very unpolished and not good garage band, I think is what I would call it. And actually, it's funny because the guys who play, I play a little bit of guitar, but not very well. And I have guys that I've known for a long time who play for me, but they're all seasoned players.
Yeah.
And I had to continually remind them to play more poorly.
Yeah, you're doing too good, guys.
You're too good. Don't do it so well, because these kids, ideally wouldn't be playing anywhere near that skill level. But it was a ton of fun to do and record with Matt Jones, who plays Badger, who actually does a lot of rock and roll playing, and is a very talented guy. And Aaron as well, and I even got to get into the booth with them and sing the choruses. So.
Did Aaron actually play drums on it?
I actually programmed all the drums.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if he was actually a drummer. Probably.
Yeah, no. There was limited funds.
Right.
Because this piece, while it does actually, in later seasons, they've thrown to it a few times, in funny instances.
Yeah.
Jesse sings it a few times, driving around with Mike in later episodes and stuff, just sort of when he's going out of his mind with boredom. But
it's a funny
in general,
idea.
when we were initially doing it, it was just going to be a little extra to go on the DVD.
Well, it's nice how they worked it into the story. This backstory about him having a band and everything. It makes sense, and you're right. It couldn't be, knowing what kind of sort of a burnout he is when Walt meets him, it couldn't be like a real talented band.
No, certainly not.
And I can hear Aaron's voice in the choruses,
Oh, yeah.
You're in there singing with him, huh?
Yep.
That must have been a really fun session.
It really was.
Well, I thought it would be an enjoyable note to go out on, but before we do, I want to mention your official website, which is daveporter.tv, not .com. I also want to remind everyone about the Breaking Bad original soundtrack, which is available in both CD form and also as a digital download. You look for it at Amazon and iTunes. I also want to give a shout out to our friend Kelly Dixon, who in addition to being an award-winning editor on the show, also had the foresight to create the Breaking Bad Insider podcast as you guys were starting season 2. So thanks to her, for every episode of Breaking Bad from season 2 forward, there was a corresponding podcast featuring a behind-the-scenes discussion of that week's episode with a revolving guest list that includes the series creator Vince Gilligan, as well as many of the show's writers, directors, and actors. Dave has appeared on it a few times himself, which greatly benefited me in preparing for this show, so thank you, Kelly, for that.
Yay, Kelly.
Well, Dave, I know how busy you are. In fact, as soon as we hang up, you're literally going to go and work on the show. So on behalf of my listeners and myself, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about all the great work you've done on the show. I really appreciate it, and we're all anxious to hear what you're going to come up with down the home stretch.
Thank you so much. I'm really flattered, Dan, and I really enjoyed speaking with you.
This podcast was recorded at Mojo Recording Studio in Phoenix, Arizona. It was engineered by Mike Post. Once again, I'd like to thank Dave Porter, Kelly Dixon, and Chandler Poling for his assistance coordinating this interview. The season premiere of the final 8 episodes of Breaking Bad is scheduled for August 11th, 2013, so be sure to mark your calendars accordingly. And now, as promised, I'm going to leave you with yet another fine example of Dave Porter's musical versatility. This is Twathammer with their original composition, Fallacies. So long, everybody.